On February 6, 1965, North Vietnamese forces attacked an American base in South Vietnam. The attack on Camp Holloway killed 7 Americans and wounded more than 100 others. And although it wasn't the first attack on American forces in or around Vietnam, it prompted a significant retaliatory response with the massive air campaign that was called Operation Rolling Thunder. And that led to the first combat deployment of the American B-52 Stratofortress. And in one of their earliest missions, a terrifying mid-air collision over a massive tropical storm would lead to a harrowing life-or-death struggle that deserves to be remembered. Throughout 1964, as tensions in Southeast Asia grew, American leaders had begun altering their B-52 fleet. Introduced in 1955, the B-52 Stratofortress was built to carry nuclear weapons and perform deterrence missions during the Cold War, which it did especially in missions like Operation Chrome Dome, an operation which kept dozens of nuclear-armed B-52s in the air at all times. In 1964, the Air Force began altering the bombers to carry conventional weapons instead of nuclear ones in anticipation that the strategic bomber fleet would be needed for combat. The first 28 aircraft were altered in Project South Bay in June of 1964, while 46 more were altered for conventional bombing in Project Sunbath later that year. This doubled the plane's bomb load from 24 to 48 750-pound bombs. The Holloway attack prompted the Strategic Air Command to move 30 B-52s along with 12 KC-135 fueling planes to Guam with the intention of bombing Hanoi soon after the attack. The strategy was championed by General Curtis LeMay, the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. On that day, in February, B-52 crews were rapidly called in to prepare for a mission unlike any they had ever flown before. At Mather Air Force Base outside of Sacramento, California, the crews of every B-52 of the 320th Bombardment Wing gathered for a briefing. Included in this gathering were Major Jim Garrick and Lieutenant Don Harton, pilot and co-pilot of a B-52. Colonel Van Parker, commander of the 320th, gave the briefing himself. According to the book Mid-Air by Craig Collins, which tells the story of Lieutenant Harton, Colonel Parker told the men of the Holloway attack. Furthermore, he said, "Our SAC planners have put forth a recommended combat mission that we believe will be effective in halting communist aggression in Vietnam." The bomber crews were ordered to leave Mather Air Force Base by 8 a.m. on February 10th. 30 B-52s, accompanied by 12 refueling KC-135s, were to fly from California to Andersen Air Force Base on Guam, where they would remain for less than 12 hours before they took off again to begin their bombing run. You will overfly Hanoi at 500 feet before rising to 1,500 feet and dropping your entire payloads on key military, industrial, and transportation targets, the crews were ordered. Already, the United States had begun its retaliation, with planes striking North Vietnam in Operation Flaming Dart within 12 hours of the attack. The attacks immediately escalated the conflict, which would soon see hundreds of thousands of American soldiers engaged on the ground. In his autobiography, LeMay was quoted that he wanted to demand that North Vietnamese draw in their horns and stop their aggression, or we're going to bomb them back into the Stone Age. The B-52 fleet was his strategy in action. But when the planes reached Guam, they soon found that SAC's plan had been put on the back burner. General LeMay, whose working relationship with McNamara had cratered and who argued against Defense Secretary McNamara's gradualism policy, was essentially pushed out and retired within weeks of the Holloway attack. The B-52s at Andersen were shelved, but the crews remained for several months while the situation in Vietnam continued to escalate. After the strategic failure of Flaming Dart, Operation Rolling Thunder, a gradual and sustained bombing campaign, began on March 2nd and would continue until November of 1968. Unlike SAC's plan, targets within or near Hanoi were strictly forbidden as hostages of possible future bombing, and the B-52s were not utilized. It wasn't until June 5th, months after they were first deployed, that the B-52s would fly to Vietnam for the first time. On June 18, 1965, 30 B-52s took off, their target an unassuming stretch of the Vietnam jungle. The plan was for the bombers to fly to the South China Sea near the Philippine island of Luzon, where they would refuel before flying to their targets northwest of Saigon. Total flight distance was around 2,500 miles and involved the planes flying over Super Typhoon Dinah, which was then passing over the Philippines on its way to Taiwan. Typhoon Dinah began as a tropical depression on June 12th, east of the Philippines, gained strength as it passed over the northernmost main island of the Philippines, Luzon, reaching its peak strength on June 17th, with sustained winds of 185 miles per hour. The B-52s flew safely over the storm in cells of 3 planes each, staged about a mile apart and feet above one another. Each B-52 had a crew of 6, pilot, co-pilot, rear gunner, an electronic warfare officer, a navigator, and a radar navigator. In the dark of the night as they flew, Lieutenant Don Harton watched as 2 planes ahead of him in the cell began a 360-degree turn. The planes were approaching the refueling site near Luzon, but the storm below them had affected their flight time, putting them about 9 minutes ahead of their schedule. That was a significant problem when trying to meet refueling planes while maintaining radio silence. Someone had ordered the 360-degree turn to get the cell to its rendezvous at the correct time, but there was a problem. Another B-52 cell was about 4 minutes behind them. According to his calculations, Lieutenant Harton realized that at the 4-minute mark, his cell would be flying directly the opposite direction of their original heading, head first into the next cell. In the book Mid-Air, Craig Collins recounts the following conversation. "Radar," Don called out. "You do realize that if there's another cell 4 minutes behind on the south track, there's a good chance it will pass them by head on." "Roger," replied the radar man. "Keep your eyes open." At his post, Harton watched as Major Gehrig returned to his seat. Gehrig, angry about the new orders, failed to properly buckle his harness. From the radar man, panic suddenly filled the plane. "We've got beacons at 4 miles and closing fast," he reported. B-52s are enormous planes that maneuver slowly but fly extremely fast. Flying at 450 knots directly towards one another, the 2 planes were closing at over 1,000 miles an hour, which gave the pilots less than 14 seconds to react. "We're on a collision course," Major Gehrig said. "We're going down." He manually forced the plane into a dive. Don watched as the second plane flew towards him, also diving to avoid collision. For one moment it seemed like the 2 planes had missed each other, and then a terrible wrenching metal sound, and boom, shook the plane. The explosion that lit up the sky was brilliant, and bright enough to be seen by B-52s, 200 miles away. As the 2 planes had tried to pass, the huge tail on the back of the second plane had sliced through the wing of Harton's plane, cutting open the fuel tank. The explosion that followed had blown off the rest of the wing. Major Gehrig ejected as Harton tried to assess the damage. He belatedly thought that the major wouldn't survive because he hadn't been buckled into his seat properly. Harton then went to his own ejection triggers and squeezed them, and it didn't work. He imagined death inside the plane for a moment before squeezing the trigger several more times, and finally was rocketed with the seat at 15 Gs out of the plane. Elsewhere in the plane, navigators Jay Collier and Terry Lowry felt the plane falling and tracked the altitude drop until it reached 25,000 feet. When they decided the plane wasn't going to survive, Jay hit his ejection triggers and was launched out at the bottom of the plane. Lieutenant James Airbies, the EWO, also ejected. On the second plane, the crew had received only a little notice. Radar navigator Lieutenant Colonel Chuck Anderman relayed the message to the pilot, Captain Joe Robertson. "Our lead squadron is rolling into a 360. We might come close to intersecting." "That's what I've been told. Be alert." When the beacons appeared on the radar, Anderman reported that too. "I've got a visual. Full dive, Robertson said. The impact was not as dramatic in the second plane, but just as deadly. The loss of the tail meant the plane, rudderless, began to go into a flat spin. Anderman was thrown to one side, and he had to hesitate to hit eject, and says he could decapitate himself if he wasn't sitting straight on the chair. But the plane was only going to spin faster, and so he hit eject. Robertson's left arm was forced to extend from the spinning, so when he hit eject, his arm clipped the plane, going numb. Whether the other crew members were able to eject is unknown. The gunners at the rear of the planes would have had to have jettisoned the tail gun in order to bail out, putting them at a disadvantage. For the 5 who managed to eject, their ordeal was only beginning. As Harton fell through the sky towards the Typhoon, his parachute opened automatically, but he had to dodge the enormous fireball left of the planes on the ocean surface. Lieutenant Collier's chute hadn't automatically opened at first because he was still strapped into his seat. Only 1,000 feet above the water, he had pulled a handle that opened his parachute, slowing his descent enough to survive the landing. Landing alive, of course, didn't mean they were safe. Each of the men had a small, teardrop-shaped raft that could just hold a single man, hardly a craft worthy of this storm. Luckily for all of them, they had landed in the southwestern corner of the storm, which was even then moving north, made landfall on Taiwan on June 18th, and rapidly lost power. Each also had a survival kit, a large bag with survival equipment, but the problem was that the B-52s had only ever served above the Arctic, and the kits were tailored for that. Inside the kit, among other things, was a small rifle that could be screwed together, an Arctic sleeping bag, wool socks, a ski mask, and an Arctic survival book. Very little of that was useful on a tiny raft in the tropics. Harton didn't find any flares, although the others did. Floating in the 25-foot swells in the dark, the airmen had no choice but to wait and hope someone would come for them, eventually. The survivors soon saw a ship which was miraculously near where they went down. a black ship with orange trim. Another ship, white, was also nearby. Harton had no flare, but several other flares went up in the dark. But neither of the ships seemed to notice. Harton was dragged underwater by his parachute, which he had forgotten to fully detach, and he was just able to cut the thing free before he drowned. The storm dissipated around them, just to let the sun beat down on them. Nausea was ever present, and when a shark appeared near Lieutenant Harton's raft, he grabbed his service revolver, thinking he'd rather die than get eaten alive. The Navy, meanwhile, put on an all-out search for survivors. Harton saw a KC-135 flying just 200 feet above the water. Soon he spotted an HU-16 Albatross seaplane working its way through the swell towards him. After 16 hours in the water, he was saved. Pulled into the plane, he found Lieutenant Colonel Chuck Anderman and Joe Robertson already on board. Robertson was at the front of the plane in the jump seat. Soon the rescue crew pulled James Erbs and Jay Collier. Finally, the plane had to take off as water was flooding into the plane from its full bilge. The plane struggled to take off in the swell, and its belly slapped loudly in the waves. After 6 attempts, the plane managed to get airborne, but before they were safe, an engine went out, taking the plane back into the water. The right propeller was mangled, and there was no way the plane was going to take off now. One of the parajumpers on the Albatross instructed everyone to move towards the rear of the plane in case we need to abandon the aircraft, and for all the exhausted men, it seemed like their nightmare was about to begin again. But as they gathered, Lieutenant Harton noticed that Captain Robertson remained at the front of the plane. "Isn't Joe Robertson coming back here?" Harton asked. "Captain Robertson is dead," the parajumper answered. After all that they had endured, it looked like everything would turn out badly after all. But just outside of the plane, less than a quarter-mile away, was the black and orange ship that had passed in the night. A longboat was already pulling toward them, full of a half-dozen men, speaking Norwegian. They were finally, actually, saved. To this day, it isn't clear who gave the order for the lead 2 bombers in that cell to make their 360-degree turn, nor why that order was given. The collision marred the first mission of Operation Arclight, but 27 of the bombers did reach their target and dropped quite a lot of ordnance, but reconnaissance thereafter determined it had little effect because it turns out that the Viet Cong forces that had supposedly amassed there apparently had moved on before the bombs fell. It was among the first of some 126,000 sorties that would be flown by B-52 bombers during the Vietnam War. Harton, Anderman, and Erbs continued to serve together, flying B-52s, and Harton served throughout the war as a fighter pilot, in the end completing more than 300 combat missions. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.